Operation Cast Lead, December 2008.
Mhm.
You were a regular voice and a regular face on the television networks in the West, including the BBC and Sky. I saw you a few times as I was monitoring also what the BBC and Sky were doing. Looking back, what was the PR strategy from Israel's point of view? And what were some of the really difficult questions that you had to answer?
So basically, the allegations that are sounded or heard on international media are pretty much repetitive. For instance, excessive use of force or targeting civilians. And this is something that obviously we had answers in advance and we prepared for. So our goal, and this is, by the way, we opened the first YouTube channel during Cast-Led operation. We're the first army in the world to really have a YouTube channel, December 2008, as you rightly mentioned. And the idea was to supply constantly proof to what we're saying, because it's fine to be a talking head, but at the end of the day, people are hungry for images, for footage, for clips. And I can say and speak about the high level of sensitivity of the Israeli pilots. And when they see civilians in the area, they would divert their missiles. But it's another thing when I actually show them a dialogue between two pilots who speak to each other and say, wait a minute, the target is here, but there are civilians here, so we must divert the missile. And this is what they do. So you see the whole thing visually. And obviously, this is something that cannot be framed or directed. So it has an element of, I would say, credibility. The questions that depend, as for the question, it depends who interviewed me. Al Jazeera, for example, usually asks me same questions like, does the IDF intend to target Palestinian children? And if so, why? So this was like an opening interview question.
The BBC do that nowadays, by the way, anyway. So, I think Sky have done it once or twice as well. So everyone's joining in.
Right. No, the challenge was a huge challenge, but, I felt that the responsibility to represent Israel was a heavy burden on my shoulders. And that's what I did for many years. And I was happy to do it.
Well, as you mentioned that, January 2009 was when the war ended. And that time, Ashdod and Beersheba were being hit by Grad rockets and Katyushas as well. As soon as it ended, people always talking about the next war was going to begin, right? But it wasn't for several years that the actual Operation Pillar of Defense, that was the 8-day campaign in November 2012. You were also a voice on the networks at that point. That was when Gaza was using M75 and Iranian Fajr rockets, which had a much longer range. Mm-hmm. And it was much harder at that point for Israel to deal with the situation. Did the PR strategy change, and was it becoming more hostile towards Israel?
No, the PR strategy, I don't think changed that much, but we did highlight, for instance, and I'm sure you all know this, but when there's a target planned, the target has to have the approval of the relevant lawyer, the military lawyer. I mean, every target has to be chosen with accordance to the international law. There will not be a target which will not be approved legally. If a target is not approved, then it will not be used. And this is something which we try to explain to the world over and over again. But you mentioned the range of the rockets, and I just want to give the audience which are listening and watching us now just an understanding of where we are today versus where we were in 2001 when the first rocket was fired, the Qassam rocket, as you mentioned, which was a homemade rocket. In 2001, 21 years ago, the first rocket that was fired had a range of 4 kilometers. And that was something within a range of 30,000 Israelis. Fast forward 21 years to today, we're talking about a range of 120, 130 kilometers of a rocket, which covers a range of almost 4 million Israelis. So this is, of course, a military challenge as well, which, of course, requires different kinds of operational tactics, which at the end of the day, I have to explain when I give the PR sound bites and give the interviews and so on and so forth. So it is very challenging. In addition to this, we found new threats. For example, the tunnels. The tunnels were something that were used primarily on the Egyptian-Israeli border for smuggling. But Hamas decided to develop a commando unit that had a specific goal, and that was to kidnap Israelis through tunnels, take control of the village and try to kidnap as many Israelis as possible.
Right. This was the war now in 2014. So now we've moved even further. And at that point, Haifa was even targeted with one of the rockets. So it goes to show how much they had developed. And it's also important to say the effect is not just Israeli casualties, or it's also the widespread psychological trauma, disruption of daily life. Rockets also caused the Ben Gurion to shut down, and which probably is their intent, would you say?
What do you mean by that? I'm sorry?
The Islamists find it very difficult to kill lots of Israelis, thank God, for our side. So therefore, do something better and psychologically affect them. Shut down the country, shut down the airport, close businesses and schools. Would you agree?
So that was their goal, of course. And if you would translate it into some kind of a victory, that would be the victory from their perspective. But I want to add that in 2012, we had a system called the Iron Dome that soon became operational, successful. And I can assure you that within the years, and we had additional operations in Gaza, the Israeli public felt more and more secure. I mean, it's not, you're not in the best mood when you have to be alert and you have to sit in shelter a few times a day. But when you know that there is a system with a 90% success rate that can probably intercept every single rocket that is trying to target your building or your school or your kindergarten, then this puts us in a whole different level. That's why Hamas and Islamic Jihad are constantly trying new methods, new ideas. And again, from going back for a second to the JCPOA, if those sanctions will be defrozen and that money will come in, then it will go into Gaza as well, helping develop new types of weapons.
I've spent
hours.
Okay,
James, can I now bring in any others who may wish to ask questions? Could you please raise your virtual hand? It's you see in the virtual hand, that is. You'll see this in under reactions. If you click on reactions at the bottom of the screen and click on raise hand. Okay, I see a Florette first, and then Gary Ogen. Florette, your question.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Can we unmute you, Florette?
Sorry.
There you go.
Avital, it's lovely to meet you, and thank you very much for looking after my son, Avi Hyman. So I'm his mom, and I'm going to ask you a question. What can we learn from the recent American journalist that was killed in Jenin? What can the IDF spokesman unit have done in a different way and to prevent this happening again? May I ask you that, please?
Avital?
Yes. Okay. So I will say the following. First and foremost, I think Israel suggested a joint investigation, something like 2 hours after the incident took place. Should the Palestinians have agreed, it would be a very simple and quick investigation because Israel needed only two things. Number one, the bullets, and number two, the helmet that she wore. That's it. Those two things were sufficient to determine exactly how she died. Number two, the funeral that took place in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, and right on the border of Western Jerusalem, was covered widely by media. I would say that the Israeli police did not practice enough restraint during the funeral, and as a result, the pictures that came out of it, the footage that came out of it was very, very anti-Israeli and really created some damage in terms of Israel's image, and that could not have been changed. Moving forward a few months, Israel obviously did a very thorough investigation with a very limited amount of tools it had. I saw very carefully the material which the IDF spokesperson released, as well as the footage, as well as the final conclusions. And I don't really think they could have done anything else at that point, especially when those two pieces of evidences were missing. I do want to say that, having said all of that, if she was not an American journalist that was dying, that was killed here in Israel, in Judea and Samaria, then the probability of any attention would be zero. And just to give you an example, the civilian war in Syria, I monitor the foreign media's coverage of the war in Syria. It took the Western media almost a year to even pay attention to that war. And the reason they woke up was because two foreign journalists were killed there, a French and a Spanish one. Until then, it did not interest anyone. And I'm looking at the numbers of journalists that were killed this year. From Al Jazeera, by the way, many names that nobody knows. I think the number is around only 12 were killed from Al Jazeera all over the world, as well as many, many dozens in other countries who are not from Al Jazeera. Did you hear any demand of investigating the journalists? So, of course, Israel is, judged on totally different measures. But again, we have nothing to hide as Israelis. And I found myself many times in front of the cameras explaining that, we don't intentionally harm civilians, and the accountability should be on those terror groups who are using them many times as human shields or firing from civilian areas. In this case, it probably was a tragic mistake. I can assure you that journalists have full freedom of movement in Israel, in Judea and Samaria, all over the place, wherever they just want, and the journalists do know it. They do know that. So I don't really see any way that this could have been conducted differently.
Okay, we've got 4 more questions. I'm going to do them in two groups of 2. So Gary Ogin and then Alex Klein, can you ask your questions? Gary.
Hi, Avital. Thanks for coming this evening. I believe and support Israel, but because I care, I have to ask these questions. I don't understand, why is the IDF so harsh when dealing with Palestinians? For example, at checkpoints, nighttime raids, closing down NGOs. The second question is, breaking the silence, the report that was already public. What's your response to that? And just by the way, since 2008, 6,000 Palestinians have been killed, 273 Israelis. It's a tragedy, but it's a bit, unbalanced.
Okay, Alex Klein, your question.
Thank you very much, Avital. Very, very interesting. Do you consider Biden a friend of Israel or not a friend of Israel? And how can you combat journalism and dishonest reporting, even though everything you say is black and they will still say it's white? So how is Israel or us being able to combat that?
Avital, over to you.
Okay, so great questions. Look, I don't know when the last time you actually visited a checkpoint, but I was there yesterday. I actually traveled the entire road, crossing the entire Judea and Samaria road number 60. If you look at the map, it's Tapuach Junction, basically Tapuach Junction just before Ariel. And then you take a right towards Nablus. I crossed the entire area because I had a meeting in some base. So I was able to travel and also cross the crossings. Today, most of the crossings are what we call flowing crossings. So there are hardly any those jams, traffic jams or human jams in the crossings. As a matter of fact, the number of Palestinians who are working in Israel on a daily basis increased. And you can ask yourself logically, how is Israel taking the chance? Because we have been under a terror wave since March 2nd, in which more than 20 Israelis have been murdered by Palestinian terrorists. Some of them had working permits in Israel, to Israel. So despite of that fact, Israel does wish to give some economic stability to the Palestinian Authority, and that's the reason why the number of Palestinian workers has increased. We're talking about something like 150,000 Palestinians who cross to Israel on a daily basis. So those harsh pictures did exist in the past. Today, most of the crossings are manned by a civilian company, which has a contract with the MOD, and just a few have soldiers. Now, another fact that we should know is that 90% of Palestinians are in areas A and B, and those areas are not under Israeli presence, except Area B, which has a partial security responsibility. So most of the Palestinians don't see military when they operate. But I do want to say this, and this is a very worrying trend that we are seeing in recent months. This has not been a year ago or 2 years ago. We are seeing an increase in the number of terror threats that we have here from the Judea and Samaria, from the Palestinians there. Part of it has to do with the fact that today there are areas which Palestinian security officials do not enter. And when they do not enter, and there is a ticking bomb in those areas, then we have no choice, but we have to send Israeli soldiers to neutralize those ticking bombs. And a place like that is the city of Jenin, which really became a terror hub. Usually Nablus was the number one, leading for many years the terrorist activities, but in the last couple of months, it's definitely Jenin. So that's about that. Breaking the silence, I have to share something personal with you. When Breaking the Silence was actually founded, I was still in the army, of course, and part of my responsibility was working with different NGOs. So I really tried to initiate some kind of a conversation with Breaking the Silence. Because at the end of the day, when you have testimonies of soldiers, according to what Breaking the Silence is providing, then you don't know who the soldiers are because they don't reveal the information. It could be a cook in a battalion somewhere, it can be a medic, it can be a driver, and it can be a fighter. So I tried to initiate a conversation with Breaking the Silence, and I have to say that I was refused. They refused to meet. And I told them many times when they were just came into to action, told them many times, let's try and understand who are the soldiers. They will not be punished. The IDF will not punish those soldiers, but we want to understand how to handle the situation. Because if you claim to be an organization who wishes to change the reality, then you can't change the reality by putting a mock pool of blood somewhere in Europe instead of discussing the reality with the army. That does not work. If you really want to change the situation, you have to speak with the army. And they refused to do it for many years, and I'm sorry about that. Biden is a friend of Israel. I do believe in that. He is a friend of Israel. He calls himself a Zionist, but it's a lot more than that. You can, during the visit a few weeks ago, you can really see the difference when he was in the Palestinian side, the Palestinian visit, which was very, very brief, very formal, almost gloomy like. It was like the way I described it. I gave a lot of commentary in Israeli television, but I described President Biden's visit to the Palestinian Authority as someone going to a shiva. That's how it felt. On the Israeli side, on the other hand, just give you a tiny example. The Israeli authorities, the officials who greeted Biden, received two main regulations or directives. Number one was not to touch him because of COVID and so on and so forth. And number two, to keep a distance of something like 1.5 meters. Those two directives evaporated the minute Air Force One touched down in Ben Gurion Airport and President Biden went down the stairs, everything evaporated, hugs, smiles, no distance keeping and all of that. So I do believe he is really a friend of Israel. He's been so for many years. This does not mean that he sees things in a different way sometimes. So that's about that question.
Okay.
Yes.
We've got time for just two more questions. We've only got 4 minutes left. So can I bring David Lazarus and Mervyn Smith in to ask questions?
Hi there.
David.
Hear me out?
Yeah.
שמעת אותי?
כן.
טוב. Now on Thursday, Baruch Hashem, I'll be down in Kibbutz Kalia. So, my question, I work in the television industry and I'm closely connected to the news. You don't get more pro-Israel than me and my wife, Sippy. So just putting the facts down. However, here in the UK, what you're slightly misunderstanding is that the news is governed heavily by Ofcom, the regulator. So every story that is presented to a news channel, and believe you me, I fight for Israel, but it can't take A or B side. It has to let the public make up its decision. It's very different to USA Fox News, and it's very different to many other countries' news. That's A.
David,
So-
we need to ask you to ask the question very quickly because we're very short of time.
Are you aware that when you get the situation here in the UK, like Sky News and BBC News, it's regulated, and we've got many Muslims that we're up against here in the UK as well. So the news has to be presented in a more diluted way than it would be in America or any of the other countries.
Thank you, David. Mervyn, just quickly, your
Apologies.
question. Mervyn. Mervyn, you're on mute.
Here we go.
Okay.
Lovely to have heard your presentation. 2 points that I'd like to make. One of them, which has been touched on by David Lazarus. The media, as far as the BBC is concerned, is dreadful as far in relation to Israel, and particularly Jeremy Bowen. And I wonder why, because Hasbara in Israel has never been top notch, sadly. Why is he allowed back into the country? He does not present facts. He comes out totally with whatever he's been sponsored with in Gaza, and nobody does anything about it.
Thank you, Mervyn.
Can I just say
very quickly.
one brief thing? It's interesting that it should be at a gathering of this nature. And I'm shocked to hear somebody want to measure the deaths between terrorists and Israelis. I find that quite despicable.
Okay.
How
All
does
right.
an Israeli
Thank-
find that?
Thank you, Mervyn. Avital.
Okay, so about dishonest reporting, this is something that happens a lot of time, of course. There's multi information channels today, and it's very difficult to understand who is saying the truth, who's not saying the truth. I think all of you here today are multipliers of power, and definitely every person can complain to the bureau chief of any channel, any media outlet when there is dishonest reporting. There are a few NGOs, by the way, like Camera and Honest Reporting, who are also working on that. So all of us, I think, are soldiers in this dishonest reporting phenomenon. The news in the UK, I'm very well familiar with this regulation. I can tell you that I remember that I did a panorama piece, a beautiful panorama piece a few years ago with Navy, talking about the flotillas trying to infiltrate maritime waters in Israel. Flotillas from Iran, flotillas from other places, and we actually took the panorama correspondent with the Navy on the boat. It was a beautiful piece, by the way, from my perspective, from an Israeli perspective. The following day that the program aired, Just across the BBC offices in London, there was a huge demonstration of Muslims and pro-Palestinian community complaining that was a pro-Israeli some kind of stories. This is not something for the first time that we tackled with, and we understand that. But today we have social media as well, and social media is an alternative channel or a completing channel for additional information. And here you're not under any regulation, so you can tweet, you can write, you can put footage, you can use facts and make our point. Jeremy Bowen, Israel is a democracy and will continue to allow entrance of journalists who are not pro-Israeli because they're not terrorists or they're not criminals. So unless he follows that ground, then he will be allowed to enter. Having said that, I think everybody knows who Jeremy Bowen is, and therefore I can assure you that the level of cooperation he will receive will be very, very limited in terms of access, in terms of information, and so on and so forth. So that's my answer about Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Avital. Can I quickly ask Steve Winston, our Vice Chairman, to propose a vote of thanks?
Hi, Avital. It's been a fascinating talk from you, some fascinating points that you've raised, very relevant, very topical. I'd just like to say a very big thank you on behalf of the National Jewish Assembly and our advisory board. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your evening. And obviously it's quite late there. It's 10:15 in the evening. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and we look forward to collaborating with you in the future.
Thank you so much, Avital, for coming. Thank you. You're welcome to stay. We have a Chairman of Conservative Friends of Israel about to join us. I think is Stephen Crabb with us?
He is indeed.
Hello, Gary. Good evening to you all.
Good evening, Stephen. I can see you. Yes, I can see you. How are you?
Very good, thank you, Gary.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to briefly introduce you, and then I'm going to invite James Marler, our Chief Executive, to have a discussion with you about CFI's work and what's happening in Parliament.
Yeah.
So, Stephen Crabb is the Member of Parliament for Presley, Pembrokeshire in Wales. He's been the MP there for the last 17 years. He served in the past as Secretary of State for Wales. He served as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. He's currently Chairman of the Welsh Affairs Select Committee, or has been since 2020. He's actually a former candidate for the leadership of the party a number of years ago. And most relevantly, he's the parliamentary chairman of Conservative Friends of Israel. And I have the honour of sitting with him on the advisory board of CFI. So James, would you like to talk to Stephen?
And I have to also just kick off with current political events very briefly. One day after the new leader of the Conservative Party has been appointed Prime Minister by Her Majesty, it's a great pleasure to be joined by a Tory backbencher, or is he? Perhaps he took a call from the Prime Minister and he's been offered a job. Let's ask him. Did you get a job, Stephen Crabb?
No, and yet again in the leadership election, I probably backed the wrong horse, even though I'm a huge friend, a long-standing friend and a big fan of Liz Truss. So I continue happily in my role chairing Conservative Friends of Israel in Parliament and chairing the Welsh Affairs Committee and running various other projects as well. But look, it's a real delight to be with you this evening, and my thanks to Gary and to you, James, and to Dahlia for inviting me and facilitating this opportunity. And I caught the last 15 minutes of that earlier discussion, which was fascinating, and it sounded like a really, really interesting topic that you're all getting your teeth into. So look, what I've been asked to do is give you an overview of CFI's work in Parliament and perhaps give you a flavour of some of the things going on here. I'll rattle through it quite quickly, and if you want to then question me on any aspect of
I've got a couple of questions lined up anyway, so let me just if I can just ask very quickly, because you brought in the Conservative Friends of Israel. I was coming on to that, but just a quick word on the new foreign minister, or the foreign secretary, as we say in this country, a good friend of Israel. James Cleverly is his name. He's well known on the front benches. He is a good friend of Israel. He works with you. Tell us a little bit about him and what can we expect from him?
So James Cleverly is, he previously did the Middle East minister job in the Foreign Office. So this is terrain that he is familiar with. When he was the Middle East minister, effectively a middle-ranking minister at the time, when Dominic Raab was Foreign Secretary, we had a lot of interaction with him, as you would understand, at CFI. Again, James is a great friend to myself and Lord Pollack and Lord Pickles, the other two leaders of CFI in Parliament. And we know him well. He knows us well. He knows CFI well. He's been out to Israel. He knows the issues. And what I would say about James, fundamentally, his instincts are the right instincts. And it's often when you're looking at a foreign secretary, it isn't necessarily have they said the right words in the past and made all the right statements. Do we believe their instincts are fundamentally sound when it comes to giving Israel a fair shout and treating issues in the Middle East fairly, and fundamentally recognizing the importance of and the strength of the UK-Israel bilateral relationship? And I would firmly put a big tick against James Cleverly, and we look forward to working with him, obviously.
So he's the right man for the job. And just finally on this subject, Liz Truss said she would look during the hustings, she would look into moving the British Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the possibility of a review on a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being the lowest. What are the chances of that happening in the next 2 years? The review, not the move.
I'm going to say 6. So
really
better than 50-50.
Wow.
I mean, she made that commitment. She is somebody who does keep her word. Having said that, there are a lot of very pressing priorities around, some very, very immediate challenges that you'll be familiar with. So with the best will in the world, this particular aspect of the UK-Israel relationship and relations in the Middle East is not going to be top of the agenda. But look, she made a very clear commitment to do that in a very public setting during the leadership campaign. And we, as the Conservative Friends of Israel, in a friendly, constructive and supportive way, will be encouraging her to move on that.
Okay, and let's see what happens. And as you said, you're the chairman of the Conservative Friends of Israel. I heard earlier this week from Lord Harrington of Watford, who was speaking, how he got involved initially, I think it was in 1997, with Lord Stuart Pollock to help out with CFI in those early days. It's a massive organization today. Tell us about the day-to-day running of the operation and how did it manage to grow into such a big outfit it is today after 25 years?
Well, thank you, James. And it's flattering that you say it's a big organization and a big operation. It's actually a remarkably small team. And you're talking about literally a handful of young staff who work very, very hard under the guidance of the advisory board and the leadership team. And Gary sits on the advisory board. And they work extremely hard because they are motivated by these issues. They're deeply passionate about it. But why do we give at least the impression of very large scale activities? Because we are busy and we get stuck in. Our vision is to fundamentally make sure that Israel gets a fair hearing in the political space, but not just in the political space. So your last discussion with your previous guest, you were talking about media bias. A group of us on the Conservative backbenches just today have written to Tim Davie at the BBC, challenging the BBC about some of their recent coverage of Israel and the Middle East, and the fact that they chose to give a platform recently to somebody who, in my view, has expressed fairly blatant terrorist sympathies. Mm-hmm. So we're active on a number of fronts. Our fundamental tool for educating and informing about Israel, which is one of our core purposes, is taking MPs out to Israel to see for themselves the facts on the ground, give them an exposure to some of the security issues in Israel, some of the exciting business and economic issues there, and let them reach at their own conclusions and form their own questions in their mind. And we find that to be an incredibly successful way of building new relationships and new friends and building new support on the backbenches and in government for Israel. Because when people go to Israel and see the range of things that we take them to and can feel just how compelling the Israel story is. And I think, without getting too philosophical about it, I think there is something about conservatives, and I don't wish to make this party political, but I think there is something about conservatives with our instinctive sympathies for business and enterprise, for the kind of open argumentative culture that very much is in Israel, and free speech and things like that, liberty and rights. There is an affinity as conservatives with the Israel story and so much of what we see out there, and as a result, we've seen some remarkable developments in, I would say, the posture of the Conservative Party in Parliament to Israel. When I was first elected in 2005, trust me, there was no shortage of Conservative colleagues of mine who would stand up and happily berate Israel in the House of Commons, who would even engage, I believe, in some of the deception and misinformation and bias that was being spread about Israel. And at that time, it was a fairly binary choice you had to make. You were either on an Arab side or you were pro-Israel. And it was a terrible position to put colleagues into. But because of the work of these delegations, informing, educating, taking members of parliament and candidates out to Israel, and I believe because some of the strategic landscape has changed, and we can talk more if you want later on about the Abraham Accords and the peace between Israel and the Emirates and Bahrain and some of the relationships there. No longer is it like that. So there are Conservative MPs who have perhaps started off their careers being from a strong Arabist tradition, nevertheless joining forces with us, raising concerns about Iran and other things. And so we're building new relationships all the time. But just to give you a flavour, since we restarted the delegations after the COVID lockdown, we restarted them in April this year. We've taken 33 of the brand new MPs who were elected in 2019. We've taken them to Israel. We've got a waiting list of more of the 2019 intake wanting to come on delegations in the future. So there's a lot of pent-up demand there. And I think it's just really, really exciting and healthy seeing these new young Red Wall MPs who've been elected part of that Boris Johnson landslide, wanting to get stuck in and learn more about Israel. I think it's really good.
And I remember a group coming out when I was in the Knesset. Actually, it was the day that David Cameron spoke to the Knesset. Yeah. And there was a whole group. I was there, and some of them were very excited. It was nice being introduced to some of them. And of course, Lord Pollock was there at the time. I read earlier today that 80% of Conservative MPs, 80% are actually members of the CFI. Is that true?
It isn't true, actually.
It's not true. Okay.
And I'll say why it's not true, because we don't ask members of parliament to become members. We're not a membership organization. We exist through relationships. And yes, there are certain MPs who really want to be identified with CFI and all the work that we do. There are others who will plug in and out of some of the debates that we speak in and encourage MPs to participate in. Others may just come along maybe once a year to an event that we run. And so we're not keeping a scorecard of who are members, but just to kind of give you an indication, when we run our annual business lunch event, our main kind of fundraising lunch just across the river in Park Plaza, we get a majority of Conservative MPs there. We get a majority of the cabinet there, lots of ministers. We'll either get the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary there. So that would give you an indication of, I think, how well we're regarded as an organisation. But in terms of strict kind of terms of do we keep a membership list? No, we don't.
Well, that's why probably the impression comes across that more Conservatives seem to be more on the side of Israel. I mean, do you think the House is becoming more partisan, a little bit like the Congress at this point? Because many Labour MPs appear today, never used to be like this, but appear today to be very critical of Israel and very supportive of the Palestinian argument, and indeed regularly use the word Palestine as if there was a state and it was just wiped off the map.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually, James, and you are spot on. There has been that shift towards a much more partisan division. Now, politically, it's an opportunity for the Conservative Party to really build deeper links with those members of the community who feel strongly about these issues. But if you take a step back and, for the long-term good of the UK-Israel bilateral relationship, we do need a strong pro-Israel voice within the Labour Party. And it's a source of sadness to me that LFI are not the force that it used to be. When you think back to when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and those LFI events at party conference, I'm told back in the late 90s, were enormous. Next month at party conference in Birmingham, the Conservative conference, we will run again our evening reception, and yet again it will be one of the biggest things on the fringe. It used to be kind of like that in the Labour Party. You go back 25 years, and it's a source of sadness that has declined enormously. There are still good people on the Labour benches who are still willing to stand up, put their neck out and talk up Israel and be willing to defend. But that number has dwindled, and you're quite right, James. The preponderance of Labour MPs who want to go out of their way to identify with the Palestinian cause, it is really quite concerning. And you go back to when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, that party conference where literally they ended his speech where they all waved Palestinian flags in a Labour Party British convention. Extraordinary.
Unheard of.
Extraordinary. And look, we could spend all evening talking about what the roots of that are and why that's come about. But I do my bit as one of the parliamentary chairs of CFI to build relationships with my opposite numbers in Labour. And on Monday at Foreign Office Questions, there was a nice bit of joint working between CFI supporters and LFI supporters around Iran, really kind of sending a joint message from both Labour and Conservative sides about the risks of the Iran nuclear deal. So we're trying to kind of foment and foster that pro-Israel side, but fundamentally this is a problem for Labour to sort out themselves.
Absolutely. We've got another 5 or 6 minutes together, and then we'll throw it out to questions to the audience. Just moving on, you are a Christian. You believe very much in the value of prayer. You celebrate that Israel is a country where Christians are not persecuted. And you said of your visit, this is a quote I got in 2007, as a Christian, I've always felt a very close affinity with the Holy Land. Is it your Christian faith that makes you that extra supportive of Jewish Israel? Where does it come from?
That's a really good question. So I grew up in...
That's twice you said that, so that's good. I'm on the right track.
I grew up in Welsh Chapel, going to Sunday school and that kind of thing, and having Bible stories drummed into me from a very young age. And I don't mean that to sound negative at all. It was a very positive thing. So yes, you grow up with a kind of an understanding of Israel, but I would say more than that. It was really reading in my late teens, reading the kind of the modern history of Israel, the founding of the State of Israel, the 6-Day War, and things like that, and the kind of some of the heroic stories that came out of that really kind of painted a very compelling picture for me. And when I was at university in the early 90s, I had the opportunity to kind of look at these things at a bit more of an academic level. And I really got interested in a very deep way in the UK's relationship with the Middle East. In fact, my final year dissertation was on the subject of pro-Arab, anti-Israel bias within the Foreign Office, which is a topic that still comes round. So that's really where it came from. But I didn't do anything particular with that interest in the time before I entered Parliament. And it was when I was running in 2005 that one Stuart Pollock reached out to me. I didn't know the guy. I'd never heard of him. He just got my number somehow, reached out to me, told me that his wife was Welsh, asked me how it's going in the seat that I was fighting, and asked me if I would like to meet up one day for a coffee and just learn about what CFI is and what it does. And which I did, because I had that interest for various reasons. And I first of all found Stuart a particularly compelling person. The guy is a force of nature, as many of you know. But what struck me about Stuart is when I was then elected, he asked nothing from me. And that was something I would say about Stuart. And, the reason I keep mentioning Stuart Pollock, Lord Pollock as he is now, is he was there at the very beginning. He was the person who really grew this this work and this organization, and it does reflect his own personal style and the way he goes about doing things. It is very, very relational. It's not transactional. And you asked me earlier, James, about the number of MPs who support or identify with the work we do. I would say one of the reasons that we have successfully expanded the work and been inclusive, to use that horrible word, is because we are fundamentally relational, not transactional. We build friendships, we help broker relationships. If a minister on our side needs to meet with a minister in Israel, we can help bring that about, we can inform and do all of those things. So I was very impressed with Stuart, and it wasn't until 2007, 2 years after I was first elected, Stuart said, look, come out and join us on a delegation to Israel. And I was hooked at on that visit. After that visit,
okay.
2007, I was absolutely hooked. It was
okay, James. I now need to sort of throw it open to questions. So, Lawrence Julius, then Karen Solomon, then Joy Wolf, then David Lazarus. We'll do it two at a time. So, Lawrence and then Karen first. Lawrence.
Thanks, Steve. The demonization and delegitimization of Israel in social media is driving hate, anti-Semitism and radicalization in Britain by providing a network nurturing a nasty narrative. The social media companies at present really act with impunity, no sanction on them, and their policing of it is poor. What plans does the government have to crack down on this?
Okay, Karen, you're on mute. Karen, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Right, you're on mute again, Karen. Okay.
Is that okay?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen, for a very interesting presentation. I live in the Bury area of Greater Manchester, and I don't know, are you aware of the terrible anti-Zionism that's happening in the Bury Conservatives there? And if so, what's being done about it? And if not, are you able to talk to me at another time and we can discuss this? Because it's really bad.
Yeah,
it's been really bad.
Yes, thank you, Karen. If I can answer your question first, Karen, if I may. I am aware of it. There's probably much more that I am not cited on. We probably do need a separate conversation away from this forum, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I've heard various things. I've also actually heard from Christian Wakeford, who was the Conservative MP who defected to Labour.
I know him very well.
Yeah, I mean, I took Christian to Israel for the first time when he was first elected, and I was very sad that he defected to Labour. But that issue aside, I mean, I have spoken to him about this issue. But Karen, it would be useful to perhaps hear from you separately, and if you're able to email me, we can set up that conversation if that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Can I get your details from
Gary?
We'll sort that out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And then the first question was about the social media companies, and you're quite right. They have provided this platform for years, really, with impunity. You'll be aware of the online.
Good question. You did good.
You'll be aware of the.
Knew about it already.
Sorry, there's some background noise. People.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So you'll be aware of the online safety bill, which is contentious in and of itself because you're into issues of free speech and all of that kind of thing. I mean, the government's approach, to answer your question directly, has been up to now really one of encouraging these social media companies to be more robust in their self-regulation. Of course, self-regulation really hasn't worked up to now, but trying to frame a piece of legislation that kind of captures this activity and other types of extremism online is proving very, very difficult and contentious. One of the other tactics that we've taken is to really try and clamp down on these organizations at source. And for a long time, Hezbollah, for example, was allowed to have a non-military wing that could come and visit the UK with impunity and spout their monstrous messages. And it's taken a long time, but it was under a Conservative government that both Hezbollah and Hamas had their military wings prescribed. And that is more than a symbolic gesture. I mean, I have heard it said, people say, well, what actually does it do? Yes, it does send the message that, we don't tolerate these kind of groups spreading their hatred in the UK. But in practical terms, it does make it harder for fundraising, for publicising, and these kind of things. And we probably need to kind of extend the kind of the net of groups that we really want to effectively outlaw and make pariah, really. But as I said, earlier on with that letter that we've just written to the BBC, when you have the nation's national broadcaster still giving platforms to people who espouse all of these same views, even if they don't wear the membership banner of one of these organisations, it is very hard. It's a cultural thing.
Thank you. Joy, then David, then Gary. We'll do Joy and David first. If there's time, we'll ask Gary. Joy.
Thank you. During the lead up to her becoming the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss certainly made some very positive statements about Israel and appears to be very sympathetic and pro towards Israel. When she was in Hale, I asked her a question about how Britain has been voting at the UN and how they haven't been challenging the Human Rights Council. Do you have any views on this and any views on how Conservative Friends of Israel can help with this?
Yeah, that's a good question too, and it has been a long-running sore. So for a long time, one of the things the Foreign Office would do was, they'd let their ministers go off and talk about our friendship with Israel and the strong bilateral relationship, and then away from the kind of public gaze over in New York at the UN, our ambassador to the UN would quietly get on with voting in ways that cut right against that message. So that is something that we have consistently challenged. I would say that we made more progress about trying to change that practice when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister than we had seen up to that point. It was kind of almost seen as a bit of a diplomatic nicety. Well, we're just kind of keeping our friendships with the Gulf or with other states. Well, you're not actually. You're indulging some pretty poisonous rhetoric at the UN, and we shouldn't be putting up with that, and we should be voting much more consistently with our allies, the US, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, and others, in challenging this. So we have seen some improvement. To caveat that, there have been a couple of votes this year where we were not pleased, and we weren't shy about communicating back to Number 10 and to Liz Truss when she was in the Foreign Office that we weren't really happy with that. So as CFI, yes, big friends, with our colleagues in government, but we're, at times we need to be use that platform of friendship to voice concerns and be critical, even when it's our own colleagues who are sitting in the seats of government.
Okay, time for two more questions. David Lazarus and then Gary Ogin. David.
Hi there. 2024 is the next election. There's a lot of work that we need to do to get the Conservative Party back to where it was, and we're just the supporters. Now, we're very scared, a group of us, and we're out mobilising, but we're not getting much support out of the MPs or the Tories. It's all very staid. It's not enthusiasm. We need more help from you lot. We're supporting you, and it's like we have to go through hooks and boundaries to get through to you lot. And we're trying to get the work out. We're scared of Labour getting in power and creating a very anti-Israel scenario. How can you help us?
Gary, would you like to ask your question? Then I'll ask Stephen to answer.
Hi, Stephen. Personally, I never understand why anyone votes Conservative, but best friends are honest with you when you make mistakes. As a friend of Israel, what would you say are Israel's current mistakes?
Okay, over to you, Stephen, to answer those questions.
Okay, I'll answer the first question while I'm trying to think about how to answer the second one. Look, was David there? Hi, David. I'm sorry to hear that you're finding it difficult to get engagement with MPs and to really build a kind of an effective campaigning link, because the truth is we are now into the tram lines to the next general election. And that's where our focus will be, and MPs should already be on a very strong campaigning footing in their own constituencies. I don't know where exactly, David, you're based, obviously, so I don't know who your local personnel are, but I know that Andrew Stevenson, who became the party chairman earlier in the summer, has been very strong all the way through the parliamentary recess, going around the country, particularly the marginal seats, drumming into not just the local MP, but local council teams and the local party membership the need to really get aligned and get focused on the need to get match fit again, if I can use that sporting phrase. So I hope you'll see some improvements there. There should be a seamless relationship with the activist base on this. And your point there about the fear of a Labour government, I mean, I would agree with you. I think Keir Starmer, if I'm honest with you, as speakers I find, I've known him for a number of years. I think he's a good man. I think his instincts on Israel are right. I think he attended a memorial service I was at actually on Monday to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the murder of the Israeli athletes in Munich, and it was good to see Keir there, and that he laid a wreath as well. But it's what lies behind that frontier of Labour politicians, because all of those hard left, pro-Palestinian activists who've created mayhem under Jeremy Corbyn, they haven't gone very far. I mean, that is the modern left, and that seam of anti-Semitism that has infected left-wing politics, that's still there. But it's not just in the UK, by the way; it's other countries around the world. And probably for another discussion, we can talk about the roots of that. But there are good reasons to be very, very nervous of a Labour victory. So coming on to Gary's question, what mistakes I think you're asking has Israel made? I think making. I think as hard as they work on trying to communicate their story and their perception, I still think they've got a long way to go in really understanding how Western media work and the way our news cycle works, and being able to convey to explain their positions. I think they've got better in terms of their self-defense, and when they have these conflict situations with Hamas in Gaza, or more recently with Islamic Jihad, I think they've got better at explaining what they're trying to do and how they conduct their operations. Where I think they've still got a long way to go is, and I don't want to kind of open up a whole big can of worms now, but the issue of settlements, for example, which when I take groups of Conservative MPs who are largely pro-Israel to Israel, it is the one question that continues to perplex them, is if there is this vision of a two-state solution that we support, and we have a broad idea in mind because of the Oslo Accords of what two-state solution will probably need to look like, what is the rationale for, I'm not talking about the settlements that are kind of just across the border and the rounding off settlements that round off existing communities, but the settlements deep inside inside Judea and Samaria, or call it the Palestinian territories, or however you want to call it. That is one of the things that Conservative MPs continue to kind of struggle with. And when questions come up in the House of Commons about settlements, it's probably one of the areas where we struggle to find Conservative MPs who feel able to stand up and give a balancing pro-Israel perspective. So I would say that Israel got work to do to explain what's going on there, justify it, and talk about explain why it's not fundamentally going to be an obstacle to long-term peace, if indeed that's the objective. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Stephen. I now ask our Vice Chairman, Steve Winston, to propose a vote of thanks.
Stephen, thank you very much. It's been fascinating to hear from you once again. I've heard you speak many times before, and you're always, it's always a pleasure to hear you. I'm sure that everyone joins me in applauding the great work you're doing with Conservative Friends of Israel. And so on behalf of the National Jewish Assembly, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Stephen. You're welcome to stay.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
But great, it's been great having you. Thank you so much. So now I come to introduce our next speaker, Fiona Sharpe, from Labour Against Antisemitism. Fiona, welcome. I'm Gary Mond. I'm the chairman of the National Jewish Assembly. just briefly introduce you, and then I'm going to invite James Barlow, our Chief Executive, to ask you some questions. So Fiona Sharpe is a spokesman for Labour Against Antisemitism. She's a co-founder of Sussex Friends of Israel and an independent communities consultant working with a number of different minoritized communities. She's currently working alongside Brighton Council, providing support for Ukrainian refugees and asylum seekers from Kurdistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. So, James, would you like now to ask Fiona some questions?
Thank you. And Fiona joins me right now, spokesperson for Labour Against Anti-Semitism. Tell us, when did Labour Against Anti-Semitism launch? What was its objective? And what has been some of the bumps along the way? Good evening, Fiona.
Good evening. And I have to apologise for my slightly damp appearance. I was out working and got caught in the most God almighty storm coming home. So literally sat down and I'm still slightly damp, so I apologise. Labour Against Anti-Semitism formed in 2017 after Jeremy Corbyn was elected as party chair. A number of people started noticing that actually this backbencher, who'd been really quite quiet for a number of years and who people really hadn't paid an awful lot of attention to, had some really troubling associations. And they noticed that that hard left that people had seen and always knew was part of the Labour Party, the SCG, the Socialist Group, had been empowered and emboldened by Corbyn leadership. And a small group of people just started really getting together and looking at what was going on in CLPs. And up and down the country, people noticed that CLPs were becoming quite emboldened and quite anti-Israel, and that anti-Israel sentiment was definitely crossing the line and becoming anti-Semitic, and they weren't being stopped. And at the same time, there was a rise in a lot of online social media activity. We saw a lot of closed groups being set up on Facebook, famously the Palestine Live group, and there was some really, really troubling content.
Give us some examples of the troubling content.
We saw, under the guise of anti-Zionism, really those old-fashioned tropes, the cartoons. The cartoons of the Jews with the hook nose, the pictures of Israel being displayed as this aggressor and using Holocaust-style cartoons. And some of the cartoons that we'd seen during Nazi Germany. And these cartoons and these images and this language was being readily shared. And this was a change, and what the change was it was becoming acceptable in certain parts of the Labour Party to propagate these views.
So just to be clear, we know that those who were writing and forming these Facebook groups and other groups on the dark side of the web, they were members of the Labour Party?
Yeah, very much. I mean, listen, I'm sure that there were one or two who weren't actually signed up members, who just voted for Labour, but a lot of them were most definitely Labour members. Okay. And it was becoming more and more acceptable. These views had always been quite small. They were fairly underground. It was the opposition to Israel and to right-wing, what was perceived as right-wing governments. But this seemed to be actually an objection to Israel's very existence.
Right. Okay. So let's just pause there for a moment. What happened was that Jeremy Corbyn, of course, became the leader of the Labour Party. Many people on the left, socialists, Marxists, communists, who were anti-Israel at the very least, felt comfortable if they joined the Labour Party because they thought they've got their man and he would be protected. So he's no longer the head of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer is there a purpose for Labour against anti-Semitism today?
I'd love to say no, but I think the election of Miss Wimborne Idrissi to the NEC last week would suggest otherwise.
Right.
That's it. No, Sir Keir is very good. I agree with what Stephen said. I absolutely believe that he is steadfast in his support not only for the Jewish community but for Israel. I had the pleasure of hearing him speak at the Labour Friends of Israel lunch last year. I don't have any doubt that he is a friend of the Jewish community and a friend of Israel.
Well, this is Sir Keir.
Yes.
What has changed under Sir Keir since he's been leader?
Well, I mean, they've had to change things because they were legally mandated to do so. The EHRC report, which didn't say that Labour was institutionally anti-Semitic. And I've heard a lot of people say that that's what it said. It didn't say that. It said that its practices weren't fair to Jewish people and Jewish members. But there were certain things that had to be enacted. They had to change the disciplinary process. They had to look at the way they were behaving. There were a number of steps that they needed to take, and Sir Keir has definitely implemented them. We see stronger action being taken against those MPs and candidates who are caught with anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist views, but it's still not enough. I mean, we still see someone like Naomi being elected to the NEC, and that's not good enough.
I get that. I hear that. Will we be seeing the waving of Palestinian flags at the Labour Party conference next month or 2 months, whenever it's going to be?
One hopes not. I mean, it was a delight, and there was a big sigh of relief when we didn't see them at the last conference. Particularly as it was in Brighton. But who knows? I hope not. I think that time in the Labour Party is done. I think that very blatant, very open anti-Israel feeling to the point where people felt emboldened to wave Palestinian flags on the conference floor is over. Does that mean that the Labour Party has, as Sir Keir has suggested, closed the door on anti-Semitism? Not a chance. There is still, unfortunately, work to be done, and we see it on a weekly basis.
I asked this question to Stephen Crabb, who's just left us right now. He agreed with me, so let me ask you the same question, that is, about the House of Commons. It's becoming more partisan as many Labour MPs seem to take the side of the Palestinian cause, and many on the Conservative benches seem to be very, very pro-Israel. Would you agree with that? And what's changed for that to happen?
I think that is global progressive politics. I think that you see, we see a similar thing in America. You see the Democrats seem to be being more pro-Palestinian, the Republican Party mainly more pro-Israel. I'm not so sure, actually, that is the case here. I'm not so sure that Conservative MPs are particularly pro-Israel. I'm really not convinced. But I think that the cause of the Palestinian people fits much more with the whole progressive liberal agenda of the Labour Party here, Democratic Party in the States, and left parties across the world, that it's part of a whole package. Supporting the Palestinian cause seems to be one of those those things that you need to do. And Israel, in and of itself, has become, the world's pariah. It has become the reason that everything falls apart. The reality is actually Israel has better relations with its neighbors in the Middle East than it's ever had. It probably has better relations with its neighbors in the Middle East than it would have had with the United Kingdom had Jeremy Corbyn been elected here, which is, to quote Jeremy Corbyn, is a little bit ironic. But I think it's an interesting one. I think that the Labour Party is pro-Palestinian, but I think we are moving towards having more MPs that are also pro-Israel. And I think with education, I think they are understanding that you can be both. And I've never understood why it was a one or the other.
Okay. Let's move on to, let's leave Jeremy Corbyn. As you said, he's something from the past in the fire of insignificance, and he's gone, at least from the front benches. You have a massive following on social media. I'm sure some of it is hostile. Some of the replies must have been really bad, and some of them would have been very supportive. What have you from having such a high profile on Twitter?
Sorry, I missed one of the words. What have I learned?
It's all right. What have you learned as being, I assume you're the main person behind the accounts, or at least one of them. So dealing with that on a regular basis with such a high amount of followers who clearly see what was taking place during the Corbyn years. What did you discover? What did you learn? What did you find out about social media?
Oh, that it's a cesspool and nobody should get involved. However, it's a necessary evil today.
But it helped you, right? It helped the cause.
Of course. I mean, it's difficult to phrase this without sounding very arrogant. But I would say that if the Jewish community and the role that Labour Against Antisemitism played in that had not schried Gewalt about Jeremy Corbyn, he possibly would have won that election because the media was really not interested in him. They thought that he might be this great alternative to Tory government. He was new, he had these ideas. Nobody was looking at what he really supported. And the more that the Jewish community drew attention to him, the more then it became attractive for the media to start looking at him. So what we learned was that social media is incredibly important for shining a light into those dark corners and into places that people don't want to look. And, Twitter is in many ways can be a wonderful thing, because if the press aren't interested in a story, we've all seen it. You put it out on Twitter and, within 20 minutes, everybody's got it. So we were able to spread messages that mainstream media weren't interested in. And I think that we learnt how important it is to have a voice. The flip side of it is that it's horrible. It is damaging to your mental health. There is nothing like waking up at 6:30 in the morning to go through your social media and find a death threat from somebody that you actually know lives within 15 minutes of where you live. It is the crossover and the intersectionality between anti-Semitism and misogyny is unbelievable. For Jewish women, it is 10 times worse. And it's horrible, but you learn to have a thick skin about it.
Just on that point of the death threat, if you knew where this person lived, presumably you reported it to the police, right? What happened?
Yeah, no, they were questioned. I mean, I'm very lucky. I have a very good relationship with our police force. I also have a very good relationship with CST. And when I called it into them, CST said to me, you have called this into the police. And I went, no, it's, he's an idiot, whatever. And they went, no, hang up now and call the police immediately.
Was he prosecuted?
He wasn't prosecuted because it was seen as being on social media, and they have a hard time. And it was a sock account, so a hidden account. It didn't have a clear link. Unfortunately.
So you couldn't prove it was, right?
No.
Can I just also clarify something? When you said Jeremy Corbyn could have won the election, you mean the 2017 one or the one that Boris won in 2019?
No, the 2019 one.
That was the one Boris got the 80-seat majority. And you think that Jeremy Corbyn could have actually won that election had it not been for accounts like yours highlighting the anti-Semitism?
No, it wasn't anti-Semitism that stopped him being elected, but the anti-Semitism caused, because there was so much noise about it, it caused the media to turn a spotlight on him. And they revealed his support of the IRA. They revealed his support of a lot of terrorist groups. The IRA connection certainly didn't play well in mainland England, obviously. And I think that it was just that it had opened the floodgates to people looking at him in a much more critical way. So okay. It certainly wasn't anti-Semitism that stopped people voting for him, but it started the ball rolling.
I got a couple more questions and then we're handed out to the audience. Do you think that anti-Semitism is on the rise in this country? Let's talk about this country, because we talk about the world where it's too big. And do you think that some bodies just focus too much on the far right, in other words, the neo-Nazis, as opposed to the anti-Semitism that is coming from communism, Marxism, socialism, and the far left?
Yeah, I mean, listen,
it's on the rise.
Every CST report will tell you that it's on the rise. I sit on the Surrey, Kent and Sussex hate crime review panel for the CPS. And I can tell you year on year, the figures for anti-Semitism are going up. So it's not just within our own, it's not just CST that are reporting this.
But just to be clear though, because CST doesn't necessarily say it's coming from the far left though, does it?
No, so they don't break it down. It's coming as much from the far left as it is from the hard right. And of course, we talk about, the horseshoe, where the far right and the hard left are meeting so closely that you can't tell the difference, because
it's the clock face.
Yeah,
12 o'clock and 6 o'clock.
They're both using the same terminology. They're both using the same conspiracy theories. They're both using the same iconography. So, in the middle of that hate is always going to be the Jews and is always going to be Israel. So what's the difference where it's coming from? Yeah, I think the far right gets more attention because traditionally they have been the ones that have been more physically violent. So more effort has been put into tracing them. And obviously, through Europe, the fear had always been coming from the far right. But
Fiona, why do some of these organizations and have a fear, not a fear, that's the wrong word, but are reluctant to say it was always the neo-Nazis, things have changed today, they're not highlighting the far left? You have a specific account that says Labour against anti-Semitism, meaning it's coming from the part of the Labour Party. Not all of it, but part of it, a section of it. And you've talked about it this evening. Why don't some of the organizations also highlight that? And also, if I may just add as well, we have with us actually a member of the NJA, a devout Muslim. I'm not sure if he's still with us this evening as well. He may also have a question for you, but also it comes from Muslims initially against Israel, and then the Jewish people didn't really have the Holocaust. The Jewish people are involved in the wars. The Jewish people control the media, which moves over to anti-Semitism. First question, why are they not highlighting the far left, in your opinion?
When you talk about other organizations
well, you mentioned the CST beforehand.
Yeah.
So let's say the CST.
I think the CST has. I think the CST have been very open about the fact that anti-Semitism is coming from every quarter. And I was about to say, I mean, you know, that between the far right and the hard left, you also have to throw in the Islamists, and the Islamists tend to be much more linked with that hard left agenda as well. So that kind of makes life a little bit more complicated as well, because they've got a slightly different agenda, but that pro-Palestinian thing links them heavily with the left, and that's always a difficult thing. In terms of CST, I mean, I think CST have been as
that's fine. That's
critical
okay.
of the left as they are the right, but again, the violence has traditionally come from the right, and so that's where they tend to look at other organizations. I don't know.
So just to clarify my words as well, that's exactly what the CST say. They say that their intelligence has actually said that there's more likely to be violent attack, in other words, arms used and bombs used, because they don't believe that the far left are actually prepared for that. Finally, let me just ask you, when you've come across some of these organizations who hate Israel, who have a problem with Jewish people, at least that's how they come across, but really their deal is Jewish people who associate themselves with Israel, which of course is a huge number, what, 90%, 80%, whatever it is. Some of them are proud, but we're Jewish. Now, our grandfather survived the Holocaust. We're Jewish, but it's Israel who's. Do you believe that they're really Jewish in some cases? Do you think that they just say it? Do you think maybe it was their ancestors? What is your thought on that?
So that's an interesting one. There were a number of accounts leading up to the election, the 2019 election, that all told the same story. I am the child of a Holocaust survivor. I never remember whether it was 57 or 53 members of my family killed during the Holocaust. They all told exactly the same story. And there were all these accounts that all had exactly the same number of family members. So I think a lot of it is rubbish. I think there are people that suffer from internalized Jew hatred. They are so uncomfortable with their own identity that they are, for want of a better expression, they are self-hating Jews. They are not comfortable with who they are and their identity, and they will make 1,000 excuses. You know, we had all those people that suddenly discovered they were Jewish and identified as Jews to support Jeremy Corbyn. Believe me, we systematically looked at people's social media accounts, and before Jeremy Corbyn was leader, there was not a single tweet about their Jewish identity, not Hanukkah, not Rosh Hashanah, not Pesach, not anything. And all of a sudden, they were proud Jews who supported Jeremy. They're a tiny, tiny proportion. Let's be really clear about that. The people like JVL are a tiny, tiny proportion of Jewish people in this country. And certainly those people are not people who I would ever describe as being part of our community, because they put themselves so far on the extreme. And you will always have people like that who sit outside their communities, who will identify when it is politically expedient. But have they ever engaged in anything Jewish? I would say most of them don't.
Okay, that's enough from me. Fiona Sharpe, thank you very much.
James,
and I was just going to say, Gary.
Yeah, thank you, James, for those questions. I'm going to Bagsy the first question for myself, and then I'm going to invite everyone else who wants to put their hands up. If you could raise your virtual hand. I see one person so far. While I'm asking my question, you can carry on and ask. My question relates to Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi and the reactions to her election. If one read the Jewish newspapers in the last few days, there was quite a robust response to the campaign against anti-Semitism, essentially saying Labour's not doing enough, needs to expel more people. But there was also another response, which came from the three so-called leading communal organisations, which I thought was quite a bit weaker. In particular, I felt that the last sentence of that response, where it said, oh, Labour must make sure that this Wimborne Idrisi doesn't have anything to do with equalities or anything to do with anti-Semitism, it seemed weak. I thought surely Labour should be looking at expelling her. Maybe I have to declare interest that I am a Conservative, so I may be biased here. But the horrible thought was going through my head that what some organisations are simply trying to do is not solve the problem, but manage it in a way to try and make the anti-Semitism look as if it's kind of like being covered up or go away without actually addressing it. I wonder what your thoughts were on the various communal reactions, both from CAA and from the three union organisations.
Look, I'm not, I don't represent either of those organisations.
I'm sure, I know that.
I work with both of them or all of them. And I think it's interesting. Yes, you've got CAA on one side and you've got the board JLC and CST, you know, on the other, who put out their joint statement. I mean, I think Labour Against Anti-Semitism was very clear on our response and where we thought, on what we thought her election represented. I think it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult for the larger organisations to find that middle ground. And I think often they do have to manage things. I actually thought the statement was good. I thought they made it clear that they weren't happy with her election. But again, they're in a position that they need, as the representatives of the Jewish community, to work directly with the Labour Party. And so I think they tend to be a little bit more diplomatic. I think CAA don't have to worry about what they say any more than Labour Against Anti-Semitism does. And we're able to be more robust when we see something that we feel is a failing in the way the Labour Party is challenging anti-Semitism.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Right, Gary Ogin, followed by Alex Klein. Gary.
Hi, Fiona. Thanks for thanks for your talk. I'm glad to say Jewish people are coming back to Labour. I mean, we took Barnet Council, which is a good example. James took my question, so I've got another one. Do you think identifying what anti-Semitism is getting more difficult to do?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. For me, no. I mean, I do think the IHRA definition is actually very, very clear. I think the examples that, you know, some people wanted to drop off the definition make it clearer. And I think that, like all forms of racism, and I spend a lot of time looking at hate crimes and hate language to all minoritized communities, I think we need to go back to the McPherson report and the definition. And you know what? If I, as a Jewish person, feel that what you say is anti-Semitic, then I shouldn't be questioned on that. That's my right. It may not be a crime. It may only be an incident. But I think we know what we feel. And I think that there has been too much politicizing of anti-Semitism, and we have allowed too many people to turn it into this political form of anti-Semitism covered by anti-Zionism. Well, anti-Zionism is okay. Well, it's not, because most of us, I imagine, on this call would say that 95% of the time anti-Zionism is in fact anti-Semitism. And there is very little difference. There are very few people who are smart enough and subtle enough that they can actually be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. So I think actually probably not. And I think actually, because it's been highlighted so much now, I think it's probably even easier to identify. And I think people are more aware of it because I think they're more aware of the tropes. They're more aware of that, the conspiracy theories. I give anti-Semitism training, And people are much more aware than they used to be. I see a lot more nodding and understanding, whereas a number of years ago, I would see completely blank faces where they just wouldn't get what we were saying. So I think there's more understanding of anti-Semitism probably, but that may not be your experience, Gary.
I think one gets different experiences according to the situations that one is in. That's my personal view. Alex Klein.
I agree with everything you said just now, Fiona, correctly. So I support what you just said, but that was not my question. Our leadership in this country, whatever it is, the Board of Deputies, JLC, it could be anybody who represents the Jewish people. I believe it's great in certain respects. They come to a table, they smile, they have a photo shoot, goodbye, we'll do something about it, says the person they're talking to. And it's not a win-win, but the Jewish community leaders think it is. Anybody can say, yeah, we agree with you, let's see what we're going to do, and nothing happens. Crown Prosecution Service, the same thing, you mentioned it yourself. Any excuse to find a way that it's not breaking the law when it comes to anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism or anti-this. If it was the other way around, Black Lives Matter, the green thing, and I think our communities or our leaders support all these wonderful causes, but they don't support strong enough the Jewish cause, the Israel cause, or the other cause, because I think they are too scared to do so. If the leadership, whether it be the Labour Party, Tory Party, or the Jewish leadership, have to stand up at some time and be strong together and be counted. What do you think of those statements?
No, listen, I agree completely. When we co-founded Sussex Friends of Israel, almost 12 years ago now, we were told to sit down and be quiet. We were told not to put our heads above the parapet. We were shunned left, right, and centre by mainstream British Jewish organisations, all of them. Nobody liked the fact that we were standing on the street and we were challenging the anti-Israel at the time. It was the anti-Zionist feeling, the BDS, the PSC. And there was a huge amount of opposition because actually there was this feeling that, you know what, be a good Jew, be quiet, just say yes and just keep your heads down and you know, the people that have the right connections will take care of things and you will just be quiet. And in Brighton, that for us wasn't an option. And anybody that was following Sussex Friends of Israel at the time, and I know some of you came down and joined us in Brighton at the time, will know that that wasn't our way. And we had colleagues that were doing a similar thing in Manchester. And from that, actually, many Friends of Israel organizations set themselves up and agreed that actually we needed to raise our voices and we needed to be loud and proud, and the only people that could advocate for us was ourselves.
So what advice would you give to our Jewish leaders on how to do what you're doing in a successful way, as opposed to yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir, you know, attitude, which is happening now, which frustrates me, annoys me, makes me angry as a proud Jew, you know, and fighting for Israel, fighting for life, fighting for our family. The biggest graveyard in the world was Auschwitz. It didn't matter whether you Reform, Orthodox, Conservative, or whatever it is. As long as you were Jew or part Jew or quarter Jew, whatever it was, you were murdered. So today, I don't want this to happen again. I don't want our children and our grandchildren to be in the same position. At the moment, it's happening quietly. And when people bury their heads in the sand and think it's not going to happen to them, that is so, so dangerous. So what do you suggest our leadership does? What do you suggest we do as a people together to combat it and to do something positive?
Well, gosh.
Wonderful question.
It is. I mean, listen, I don't know that it's for me to suggest what those people in prominent leadership positions do. I think that they're doing a pretty good job. I think it is difficult to straddle being diplomatic and still having that place at the table and having the support of the community behind you. And I think it is much easier to be outspoken and to bang on the table when you're an activist, because I think that there are less restrictions on what we do and how we behave. What I would say is that everybody can be an activist. And if you feel strongly about something, it's not, I get tired of hearing people say, someone's got to do something. Be that someone.
I do, honestly.
Okay, sorry, we've only got time for one more question. Joy Wolf, last question. Joy, you're on mute. You're on mute, Joy. Joy, you're on mute. Can you come off mute? Joy, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Joy, I'm sure you've got many words of wisdom for us. Let's hear them.
Can't hear a word you're saying, Joy. Sorry. Oh dear. Last one of the night as well. Can you try to come off mute, Joy? Last time of asking. Oh dear.
Right, sorry. Hi, Fiona.
Oh, you're there. Great. Just I was about to give up.
Sorry. Unfortunately, some of our worst enemies are Jews and Israelis who are outspoken against Israel. You've got your fair share down there. I can't remember her name, the Green woman, and Tony Greenstein. What can we do about these people? I mean, it is so difficult to, when somebody quotes and says, well, Ilan Pappy says this, or things like that. It's our worst problem.
Yeah, no, listen, talking to you, Joy, is like teaching my grandmother to suck eggs. And I feel like I can't, you have been doing this and have been such an incredible example to all of us for so long. And you know what it's like. I think, look, for me, there is no point in a conversation with the likes of Tony Greenstein. There is, however, a point in a conversation with Caroline Lucas, the Green MP who's in Brighton, who has improved from the time that I started doing this in the last 10 years. She has really softened in her position. She is never going to be a fan of Israel, but she doesn't want it not to exist. And she is much better. And she is someone as a community that actually we can work with. And she has been supportive as a community. She comes to our community events. She is supportive. She understands from a Jewish perspective what our fear is around anti-Semitism within the community. So we're getting there. So I think it's also about being less combative and not doing everything in public, and having those quiet conversations one-on-one with people and just bringing them some way along the line, understanding that with some people you're not going to get them all the way there, but at least if you get them somewhere along the line so that they are at least friends or allies to local communities, that for me is a good place. When you've got somebody that starts off as being so anti, at least bring them along gradually. And I think that can be done with quiet conversations and really working hard.
You've certainly done well with her. Do you think one of the things that we ought to be doing is try to spread a little more about all the good things that Israel does around the world? Do you think we're not good enough at that?
No, completely. Israel is just rubbish at doing its own PR. It is such a shame because there are so many incredible projects and people, MPs both Labour and Tory, and actually all of them, the Liberal Dems as well, when they go on the trips to Israel, they all come back talking about how wonderful Israel is, and that they didn't realize that there were so many on the ground organizations of Israeli Arabs and Jewish Arabs working together, of Palestinians and Jews working together. They're not aware of what goes on because those are the things that never get talked about. So I think that, you know, we really need to encourage Israeli organizations to come over here and spread the good work that they're doing. You know, the environmental work that they're doing, the equalities work that they're doing, you know, LGBTQ plus work that they're doing. There are so many fantastic projects in Israel that get completely ignored because all we ever hear is the noise of the Israel-Palestine debate. Well, there's a whole lot more going on because, as you know, people are living there. People live their daily lives and they're getting on with their neighbors and they're going about their business and they're looking at how they make their lives better. And that's what we need to be talking about.
Yeah, thank you. I'm now going to ask Steve Winston, our Vice Chairman, to propose a motion of thanks. Steve.
Hi, Fiona.
Hello, Steve.
It's been absolutely great to have you join us. You've been asked some very deep questions and you've given some amazingly in-depth answers, but also very concise. It's just been a pleasure seeing you and having you speak with us this evening. So now it's almost time for you to go and dry off. So thank you again on behalf of us, the National Jewish Assembly, and you know, personally and professionally, I hope to see you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Fiona. And can I remind everybody who hasn't registered yet for our meeting on Sunday morning about the Holocaust Memorial near Parliament? It's going to be very interesting. We have quite a lot more people registered for that than we have for today because we made it open to non-members as well. It should be a fascinating morning. I don't know if Fiona, you take an interest in that at all. The issue of the Holocaust Memorial, one way or the other. I know people are going to speak in favour. I know people are going to speak against it. I know people who are literally not yet sure. But we're the only organisation that are running a public debate on it. And we've put adverts in all the major Jewish newspapers, so hopefully we'll get a very good turnout for that. So can I arrange me to thank everybody very much for coming tonight. If you want to register for Sunday, go to our website. You can register there. And I wish you all a very enjoyable rest of the evening. And our next Zoom speaker meeting with 3 speakers will be on the 25th of October.